Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is why ancient Rome's worst district was feared. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Why ancient Rome's worst district was feared, the street. No Roman wanted to cross after dark. The sun was beginning to sink behind the rooftops of Rome, painting the sky with shades of deep orange and fading crimson. From the highest hills, the city looked magnificent. Marble temples reflected the evening light. Statues of emperors stood proudly over busy forums. The great arches and towering columns reminded everyone that Rome ruled much of the known world. To a traveler arriving for the first time, it seemed like the greatest city humanity had ever built. But appearances in Rome could be dangerously deceptive. Just beyond the grand monuments and elegant villas, another Rome waited. It was a Rome hidden from visiting ambassadors and wealthy merchants. A Rome that respectable citizens preferred not to mention in polite conversation. A place where luxury gave way to decay in just a few streets, where the smell of fresh bread was quickly overwhelmed by smoke, sewage, and rotting garbage. This was the Rome that ordinary people knew far too well. As daylight faded, the atmosphere changed almost instantly. Shopkeepers who had laughed with customers only moments earlier began pulling heavy wooden shutters across their storefronts. Iron locks clanged into place. Street vendors packed away their goods with surprising speed. Those who had lived here long enough knew one simple rule. If you could be home before darkness arrived, you should be. No one wanted to linger. The streets themselves seemed to transform. Shadows stretched across the narrow alleys, swallowing corners where the last rays of sunlight could no longer reach. Oil lamps flickered in a few windows, but they illuminated little more than patches of uneven stone. Beyond their weak glow, darkness gathered like a living thing. Footsteps became quicker. Voices became quieter. People avoided eye contact. Everyone hurried somewhere. You might have wondered why. After all, this was Rome, the mighty capital of an empire, protected by disciplined legions and governed by powerful laws. Surely the streets of the greatest city in the world should have been safe. The reality was far more complicated. Ancient Rome was a city of extraordinary contrasts. A senator could finish an extravagant dinner served on silver plates, while only a few hundred yards away, an entire family searched through refuse for scraps of food. Rich citizens bathed in luxurious public baths decorated with colorful mosaics, while countless laborers returned to overcrowded apartments that barely kept out the rain. The wealth of Rome was real. So was its misery. Nowhere was that contrast more visible than in the city's most feared neighborhoods. These districts were packed with towering apartment buildings known as insulae. Many rose 5 or 6 stories high, leaning slightly toward each other over streets so narrow that neighbors could sometimes speak from opposite windows without raising their voices. From below, they looked unstable, their cracked walls stained by decades of smoke and rain. Wooden balconies sagged under the weight of too many people. Roof tiles shifted dangerously whenever strong winds swept through the city. every floor told a different story. The lower apartments, though still modest, were occupied by families who could afford slightly better conditions. They enjoyed easier access to water and a little more security. The higher you climbed, the worse life became. Families squeezed into tiny rooms, no larger than modern storage spaces. Several generations often lived together in conditions that left almost no room to move. During summer, unbearable heat collected beneath the roofs. During winter, cold winds slipped through every crack in the walls. There was little privacy, little comfort, little hope. Outside, the streets never truly rested. Donkeys pulled overloaded carts across rough paving stones from before sunrise until late into the night. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron. Bakers prepared bread long before dawn. Children chased one another through crowds while stray dogs searched for discarded food. The sounds blended into a constant roar that became the heartbeat of the city. And then there was the smell. Visitors wrote about it with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Smoke from thousands of cooking fires drifted through the air. Fish markets left behind a powerful odor that lingered for days. Tanneries treated animal hides using methods so foul that entire neighborhoods seemed poisoned by the stench. Human waste flowed through open drains or collected in places where no one bothered to clean. Even expensive perfumes worn by wealthy Romans struggled against the city's overwhelming scent. Yet for those born here, this was simply life. They adapted, they endured, they survived. But survival required caution. As darkness settled over the city, honest citizens disappeared indoors because another population was preparing to emerge. Professional thieves knew every alleyway. Pickpockets watched crowded intersections. Escaped slaves searched for places to hide. Violent gangs gathered in abandoned courtyards. Drunken fights erupted outside taverns, where cheap wine flowed until sunrise. Sometimes arguments ended with bruises. Sometimes they ended with bodies lying forgotten in the street. The city watch existed, but Rome was simply too large. Narrow lanes twisted in confusing directions, making it nearly impossible for guards to respond quickly. By the time help arrived, the attackers were usually gone, disappearing into a maze of streets they knew better than anyone else. People learned not to ask questions. If someone screamed in the darkness, many closed their windows. Not because they lacked compassion, because they feared becoming the next victim. The district earned its terrible reputation one story at a time. A merchant robbed while returning home. A family buried beneath a collapsing apartment. A warehouse consumed by flames that spread through wooden buildings with terrifying speed. A traveler who entered the wrong alley and was never seen again. Whether every tale was true hardly mattered. Fear has a way of growing larger with every retelling. Soon, parents frightened children simply by mentioning certain streets. Be home before sunset. Don't wander alone. Stay away from those alleys. These warnings became part of everyday life. Yet, despite its dangers, thousands continued living there because they had no alternative. The poor could not simply move to safer neighborhoods. Rent elsewhere was impossible to afford. Work existed nearby. Markets provided food. Even dangerous streets were better than starvation outside the city walls. For many Romans, fear was not a choice. It was a neighbor. It was something they greeted every morning and every evening. And hidden within these crowded streets was a district whose name would become synonymous with crime, poverty, disaster, and survival, a place where the true face of ancient Rome revealed itself more honestly than anywhere else in the empire. Most visitors never saw it. Those who did never forgot it. Entering the district. Everyone warned you about it. Imagine waking before sunrise in ancient Rome. The city is still wrapped in darkness, yet the silence lasts only a few moments. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows. A donkey begins braying as its owner loads heavy sacks onto a cart. Bakers are already tending their ovens, and the smell of fresh bread briefly fills the cool morning air. For an instant, Rome feels peaceful, but that feeling doesn't last. As the first rays of sunlight creep over the rooftops, the city bursts into life. Thousands of people pour into the streets at once. Merchants shout over one another, hoping to attract customers before the crowds become impossible to manage. Blacksmiths strike glowing iron with rhythmic blows that echo through the narrow lanes. Children weave through the chaos barefoot, laughing as if they are completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. If you followed the flow of people, leaving behind the grand temples and elegant public squares, you would soon notice the city beginning to change. The streets become narrower, the buildings become taller. The sunlight struggles to reach the ground. Here, the magnificent Rome, celebrated by poets, seems to disappear. Instead, endless apartment blocks lean toward one another like tired giants. Their upper floors almost touch, leaving only a thin strip of sky visible overhead. Laundry hangs from wooden balconies. Buckets are lowered by ropes from high windows because climbing 6 flights of stairs several times a day is exhausting. Every inch of space is occupied. Every doorway tells a different story. One family prepares breakfast over a small charcoal stove, while only a few feet away, another argues over unpaid rent. An elderly woman sells vegetables from a wooden crate. Across the street, a young laborer sharpens his tools before searching for work. A group of slaves hurry past carrying heavy amphorae filled with wine, careful not to spill a single drop that doesn't belong to them. The district is alive, but beneath that energy lies constant tension. Unlike the wealthy neighborhoods where guards patrol private estates and servants maintain order, this part of Rome survives largely on its own. Here, people rely on neighbors they trust and avoid. Those they don't. Reputation matters almost as much as money. Everyone knows who the troublemakers are. Everyone knows which streets to avoid. Some alleys have nicknames whispered rather than spoken aloud. Certain taverns are famous not for their wine, but for the fights that break out almost every night. Some apartment buildings have such terrible reputations that new arrivals refuse to rent rooms there, even when the price is unbelievably cheap. The poorest residents have little choice. A roof is a roof, even if it might collapse. As the morning continues, another reality becomes impossible to ignore. The smell. It seems to come from everywhere at once. Fresh bread mixes with fish left too long in the market. Smoke from hundreds of cooking fires hangs in the air. Open drains carry waste through the streets, while piles of garbage wait for someone to remove them. Though that someone often never arrives, flies gather by the thousands. Rats dart between broken barrels. Dogs fight over scraps tossed into the street. To modernize, the conditions would seem unbearable. Yet for many Romans, this was simply normal life. Children grew up playing beside open drains because they knew nothing different. Families ate meals while ignoring the odors around them. Life demanded adaptation, and those who failed to adapt rarely lasted long. Water is another daily challenge. Rome is famous for its aqueducts, incredible engineering projects that carried fresh water from distant hills into the city. Public fountains provide clean drinking water to many neighborhoods, but reaching that water isn't always easy. People living on the highest floors of crowded apartment buildings must carry every bucket themselves. Imagine climbing 5 or 6 flights of steep wooden stairs several times each day, balancing heavy containers without spilling them. Every trip is exhausting. Every bucket matters, because without enough water, cooking becomes difficult, cleaning becomes impossible. Disease spreads quickly, and disease is one of the district's most dangerous residents. There are no microscopes, no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria. People know sickness exists, but they rarely understand why. A simple cut can become deadly. Fever sweeps through entire buildings without warning. One family falls ill, then another, until the neighborhood is filled with grieving relatives, carrying bodies toward crowded cemeteries beyond the city walls. Death is common enough that most people no longer speak about it with surprise. Instead, they simply continue living. Because they must. By midday, the streets become almost impossible to navigate. Street performers entertain passing crowds. Fortune tellers promise impossible futures. Merchants argue over prices. Beggars stretch out trembling hands. Foreign travelers speak languages from every corner of the empire. Egyptians, Greeks, Gauls, Syrians, North Africans, Spaniards. Romans from every province walk the same streets, creating a city unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Yet beneath this diversity, inequality remains impossible to hide. A richly dressed senator passes through in a litter carried by slaves. People step aside immediately, not out of respect, out of necessity. His expensive perfume briefly masks the smell of the streets before disappearing as quickly as he does. Within moments, life returns to normal. The senator leaves, the poverty remains. As afternoon slowly turns toward evening, subtle changes begin again. Shopkeepers glance nervously toward the sky. Parents call children indoors. Laborers hurry home with their day's wages hidden beneath their clothing, because everyone knows what happens next. Darkness is approaching. And in this district, darkness changes everything. The streets that seem merely crowded during daylight will soon become places where footsteps quicken, voices fall silent, and even experienced Romans think twice before turning the next corner. The city is about to reveal the side it never wanted the world to see. When the sun went down, fear took over. As the final rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills surrounding Rome, the city seemed to exhale. The crowded markets slowly emptied. The shouting merchants packed away their scales and baskets. The smell of freshly baked bread faded, replaced by smoke from hundreds of cooking fires rising into the evening sky. For many Romans, this was the signal to go home. Not because the day was over, because the night belonged to someone else. Unlike modern cities filled with electric lights, ancient Rome became remarkably dark after sunset. Only a handful of oil lamps illuminated the main streets, and even those produced little more than a weak flickering glow. Their light barely reached beyond a few steps, leaving long stretches of road swallowed by darkness. The narrow alleys were even worse. Many received no light at all. Standing at the entrance of one felt like staring into an endless black tunnel. You could hear voices. You could hear footsteps. Sometimes you could hear laughter, but you couldn't always see who or what was waiting inside. This darkness gave criminals their greatest advantage. A pickpocket needed only a second. A mugger needed even less. If someone cried out for help, the attacker could disappear through a maze of twisting lanes before anyone understood what had happened. The district's layout made it almost impossible to pursue anyone. The streets had grown naturally over centuries instead of being carefully planned. Some were barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. Others ended suddenly in dead ends or opened unexpectedly into crowded courtyards where dozens of doors offered perfect escape routes. Even lifelong residents occasionally became lost. Imagine being a traveler. You arrive after sunset, convinced that you know the way back to your lodging. Every alley looks the same. Every building appears identical in the darkness. Then you realize you've taken a wrong turn. Your heart begins to race. Behind you, footsteps echo against the stone pavement. Are they simply another traveler or someone following you? You don't know. So you walk faster. The footsteps grow faster too. You resist the urge to look back. Instead, you grip your money pouch tightly beneath your cloak. You remind yourself to stay calm. But calm is difficult when every shadow feels alive. This uncertainty frightened people as much as actual violence. Fear often begins long before danger appears. Roman writers occasionally warned readers about walking alone at night, describing it as an unnecessary risk. Wealthy citizens sometimes traveled with servants carrying torches, not only to light the way, but also because criminals were less likely to attack larger groups. The poor had no such luxury. If they finished work late, they walked home alone. Every evening became a gamble. The taverns now came alive. From the outside, their warm light spilling onto the street looked inviting. Inside, however, the atmosphere could change in an instant. Cheap wine flowed freely. Arguments started easily. A spilled drink, an accidental shove, a careless insult. Any of these could become the beginning of a violent fight. Tables overturned. Clay cups shattered across the floor. Knives appeared before anyone had time to think. Sometimes the conflict ended with bruises and broken noses. Sometimes someone never walked out again. Yet people kept returning. Not because taverns were safe, because after endless hours of hard labor, many Romans wanted a place where they could forget their exhausting lives, even if only for a few hours. Outside, another danger quietly moved through the streets. Professional thieves rarely acted alone. They observed. They waited. They looked for people carrying heavy purses or expensive clothing that suggested wealth. A merchant returning from the marketplace, a messenger carrying important documents, a visitor unfamiliar with the neighborhood. These were ideal targets. Often, victims weren't attacked immediately. Instead, they were followed. One criminal watched from a doorway while another waited farther ahead. By the time the victim realized something was wrong, escape had become almost impossible. Some gangs controlled entire streets. Residents knew exactly where their influence began and ended. Crossing into the wrong area could mean paying an unofficial toll. Refuse to pay, and you might regret it. The city watch existed, but their numbers were limited. Rome was simply too vast. Thousands of streets stretched across the capital. Protecting everyone was impossible. Many officers focused on preventing large disturbances rather than chasing individual criminals. By the time help arrived, witnesses often claimed they had seen nothing. Not because they were lying, because speaking against violent gangs could make tomorrow even more dangerous. Silence became another survival skill. There was another reason Romans dreaded the night: fire. Today, we think of fire alarms, fire engines, and organized emergency services. Ancient Rome had none of these. Most apartment buildings were constructed using large amounts of wood. Wooden floors, wooden staircases, wooden balconies. Cooking was done over open flames. Oil lamps burned inside cramped rooms. One overturned lamp, one forgotten cooking fire, one careless spark. It was all it took. Flames spread frighteningly fast. Once one building caught fire, neighboring buildings often ignited within minutes because they stood so close together. People sleeping on the upper floors faced a horrifying choice: run through smoke-filled staircases or jump. Some escaped. Many didn't. Those who survived often lost everything they owned before sunrise. Their homes disappeared into ashes. Their possessions vanished. Their lives had to begin again from nothing. Even the famous Emperor Augustus reportedly worried about Rome's constant fire hazard, and later emperors introduced better firefighting organizations. But during much of Roman history, fire remained one of the city's greatest nightmares, especially in districts packed with overcrowded apartments. As midnight approached, the city grew quieter. But it was never truly silent. Somewhere a baby cried. A dog barked into the darkness. A drunken voice sang an off-key song before fading into the distance. The wind carried the smell of smoke through empty streets. And in countless tiny apartments, families lay awake listening for footsteps outside their doors, listening for shouts in the street, listening for the crackling sound they feared most. Because in ancient Rome's most dangerous district, surviving the night was never something anyone could take for granted. For many people, the greatest victory wasn't becoming rich. It wasn't becoming famous. It was simply waking up to see another sunrise. And as terrifying as the nights were, the daylight revealed another danger that was just as deadly, one hidden high above every Roman's head, the buildings that could kill without warning. When people imagine the dangers of ancient Rome, they often think of gladiators fighting in the Colosseum, brutal wars fought by Roman legions, or deadly political conspiracies inside the Senate. Those dangers certainly existed, but for the average Roman living in the city's poorest districts, the greatest threat was often much closer to home. Sometimes, it was the building itself. Every morning, as the first light reached the narrow streets, thousands of residents stepped outside and looked up, not to admire the architecture, but to judge whether another apartment building might collapse that day. It may sound unbelievable, but this was a very real concern. Rome's population had grown faster than the city could safely handle. As more people poured into the capital from every corner of the empire, the demand for housing exploded. Wealthy property owners saw an opportunity to make fortunes. Instead of building spacious homes, they constructed tall apartment blocks, known as insulae, designed to squeeze as many tenants as possible into the smallest amount of space. The more rooms they could rent, the more money they earned. Safety often came second. Some builders used high-quality stone and solid foundations. Many did not. Cheap materials meant larger profits. Walls were made thinner than they should have been. Wooden beams were sometimes too weak to support the weight above them. Repairs were delayed because repairs cost money. As long as rent continued arriving, many landlords ignored the cracks spreading across their buildings. The tenants noticed them. But what could they do? Moving elsewhere was rarely an option. Most families barely earned enough to buy food. Finding another apartment was almost impossible. And even if one became available, it was often just as dangerous as the last. So people stayed. They hoped. They prayed. And every time they climbed another creaking staircase, they trusted that it would hold for one more day. Life on the upper floors was especially difficult. Imagine carrying everything you owned up 5 or 6 flights of narrow wooden stairs, every bucket of water, every basket of food, every piece of firewood, every single day. There were no elevators, no running water reaching the upper levels. Even something as simple as washing clothes became exhausting. Older residents dreaded every trip. Pregnant women climbed slowly, gripping worn handrails, polished smooth by generations of hands. Children ran up and down with the energy only youth could possess, unaware that the very floors beneath their feet might not be as strong as they seemed. When storms arrived, fear increased. Heavy rain seeped through damaged roofs. Water collected inside walls, weakening timber that had already begun to rot. Strong winds shook entire buildings, causing loose roof tiles to slide into the streets below. Pedestrians quickly learned another unwritten rule of Roman life. Never walk too close to apartment buildings, not because they might collapse, because something could fall from above. Broken roof tiles, wooden beams, flower pots, buckets, even household waste. The Roman poet Juvenal joked that anyone walking through the city should first write their will before venturing beneath apartment windows at night. Behind the humor lay an uncomfortable truth. People really were injured, or worse, by objects thrown or dropped from upper floors. Some accidents were unavoidable. Others were caused by carelessness. A bucket emptied from a 6-story window became a deadly projectile before reaching the street below. And not everyone bothered checking whether anyone was walking underneath. The streets themselves bore the scars of these hazards. Cracked stones, broken masonry, collapsed walls left standing until someone finally removed the debris. Children treated the ruins like playgrounds. Adults walked around them without a second glance. Disaster had become ordinary. Occasionally, however, ordinary became catastrophic. One loud crack, a deep rumble, then chaos. An entire section of a building might suddenly give way. Dust exploded into the street. Timber snapped like dry branches. Stone blocks crashed onto neighboring houses. People screamed. Neighbors rushed outside. Some desperately clawed through rubble with bare hands, ignoring splinters and sharp stones. Others stood frozen, unable to believe that the home they had entered only hours earlier no longer existed. The luckiest escaped with injuries. Many never escaped at all. Roman historians recorded several complaints about unsafe construction, showing that these collapses were not rare accidents, but recurring problems in a city expanding beyond its limits. Even emperors struggled to control dishonest builders. New regulations were introduced, height limits were imposed, building standards were tightened. Yet enforcement remained inconsistent. Money often found ways around the law. A wealthy landlord could rebuild quickly after a collapse. The tenants who died could not. Despite everything, life continued. It always did. Within days, nearby merchants reopened their stalls, Children returned to playing in the streets. Laborers searched for work. Fresh tenants moved into neighboring apartments because they had nowhere else to go. Fear lingered, but survival demanded resilience. There was another cruel reality. Many Romans believed disasters reflected the will of the gods. If a building collapsed, some saw it as terrible luck. Others believed the victims had somehow offended divine powers. Few blamed poor engineering alone. Without modern science, explanations often mixed religion, superstition, and rumor together. Every tragedy produced new stories. Some claimed haunted spirits wandered ruined buildings. Others whispered that certain landlords had cursed properties built on sacred ground. The truth was usually far simpler. Greed, neglect, and overcrowding. As the city continued growing, these dangerous buildings became symbols of a deeper problem. Rome looked unstoppable from the outside, but beneath its glorious monuments, countless ordinary people lived one cracked wall away from disaster. Yet collapsing buildings were only one of the district's many dangers. For beneath the streets themselves lurked another enemy, one that could not be seen until it was already too late. Disease. And once disease entered these crowded neighborhoods, it spread faster than anyone could stop it. The invisible enemy that haunted every street. There were dangers in ancient Rome that you could see long before they reached you. A crumbling building, a gang waiting in a dark alley, a fire spreading from rooftop to rooftop. Those threats were terrifying, but at least they gave you a chance to run. The most dangerous enemy in Rome offered no such warning. You couldn't hear it. You couldn't smell it. You couldn't fight it with a sword. By the time you realized it had entered your home, it was often too late. Disease was one of the greatest fears in ancient Rome, especially in the city's poorest districts. While wealthy Romans could sometimes escape to countryside villas during outbreaks, ordinary families had nowhere to go. They remained trapped inside crowded neighborhoods, where illness moved silently from one household to the next. The conditions made it almost inevitable. Imagine walking through the district just after sunrise. The streets are already crowded with thousands of people. Children play barefoot on the same stones where garbage was dumped the night before. Vendors prepare food only a few steps away from open drains, carrying waste through the city. Stray dogs wander between market stalls searching for scraps, while rats disappear into holes beneath broken walls. No one understands germs. No one knows about bacteria or viruses. People simply know that sickness appears, and when it does, it spreads frighteningly fast. A man wakes with a fever. By evening, his wife begins coughing. A few days later, their children can barely stand. Soon, neighbors living across the hallway fall ill as well. Within weeks, an entire apartment building may be suffering from the same mysterious illness. Rumors spread even faster than the disease itself. Some believe the gods are angry. Others blame poisoned air drifting through the streets. Many carry small charms or offer sacrifices at temples, hoping divine favor will protect their families. Faith brings comfort, but comfort cannot stop an epidemic. The apartment buildings make everything worse. Families live so close together that privacy barely exists. Walls are thin enough for neighbors to hear conversations, arguments, even whispers. If one person becomes sick, everyone nearby is exposed. Fresh air is scarce. Sunlight rarely reaches the lower floors. Moisture clings to the walls. The smell of smoke from cooking fires fills the cramped rooms. Breathing itself becomes difficult. Doctors exist in Rome, but medicine is still in its infancy. Some physicians are remarkably skilled for their time, especially those influenced by Greek medical knowledge. They can treat wounds, set broken bones, and perform surprisingly advanced procedures. But when invisible diseases spread through crowded neighborhoods, even the best doctors often have little to offer. Patients are prescribed herbal mixtures, warm baths, special diets, prayers. Sometimes these treatments help, many times they don't. People recover or they don't. No one fully understands why. The emotional toll is just as devastating. Picture a mother sitting beside her child's bed through the night. She wipes sweat from the little boy's forehead again and again. She whispers reassuring words. She promises everything will be all right, but deep inside as she knows many other children on the street have already died from the same illness. All she can do is wait. Sometimes mourning brings hope. Sometimes it brings silence. Death becomes so common that funeral processions pass through the streets almost every day. Neighbors pause briefly as mourners carry simple wooden coffins toward the city gates. Then life continues. Markets reopen. Children laugh. Blacksmiths return to work. Rome never stops moving. Because if it did, the empire itself would stop. Clean water is another constant struggle. Rome's famous aqueducts are engineering marvels, supplying enormous quantities of fresh water to fountains and public baths. Yet access is not equal. The wealthy often enjoy private water connections. The poor rely on public fountains carrying heavy buckets back through crowded streets. If the nearest fountain is busy, people wait. If water spills during the climb home, they simply make another trip. Every drop matters. Public baths are among Rome's greatest achievements, serving not only as places to wash, but also as centers of social life. Rich and poor alike visit them whenever possible. For many people, they provide the cleanest environment they experience all week. Yet even these baths are not always as hygienic as modern visitors might imagine. Hundreds of people use the same pools every day. Water is changed far less frequently than we would expect. Still, compared with many other ancient cities, Rome's bathing culture represents a remarkable attempt to maintain cleanliness. Even so, disease continues to find opportunities. Food creates another challenge. The markets are overflowing with bread, olives, vegetables, fish, wine, and fruit. But not every merchant is honest. Spoiled food is sometimes sold to desperate customers. Meat left too long in the summer heat quickly becomes dangerous. Fish imported from distant ports may already be beginning to rot before reaching the market. Poor families cannot afford to be selective. If food looks barely edible, they buy it. Because hunger is an even more immediate threat. The district becomes a constant balancing act between survival and risk. Drink questionable water or become dehydrated. Eat suspicious food or go hungry. Live in overcrowded housing or sleep in the streets. None of the choices are good. Yet millions of ordinary Romans make these decisions every single day. Perhaps the most heartbreaking reality is how normal all of this feels to those living there. Children grow up believing this is simply how cities work. They don't dream of cleaner streets because they've never seen them. They don't question the constant funerals because death has always been part of life. To them, this isn't extraordinary. It's home. And still, despite disease, poverty, dangerous buildings, and violent nights, the district refuses to collapse completely. People continue opening shops, parents continue raising children, neighbors continue helping one another during the hardest times, because even in Rome's most feared neighborhood, human resilience proves stronger than fear. But another force is quietly shaping life inside these crowded streets. It doesn't spread illness. It doesn't destroy buildings. Instead, it controls people through power, violence, and fear. The gangs of ancient Rome are beginning to take control. The gangs that ruled the streets. As dawn broke over Rome, the city appeared peaceful once again. Merchants arranged baskets of olives, figs, and fresh bread outside their shops. Laborers hurried toward construction sites, docks, and workshops before the day's work began. Children chased one another through the streets, their laughter briefly drowning out the endless noise of the city. To a visitor, it looked like another ordinary day. But beneath that ordinary routine was a reality that everyone who lived here understood. The streets did not truly belong to the government. In many places, they belonged to the gangs. Unlike the organized crime syndicates people imagine today, the gangs of ancient Rome were often loose groups of young men, former soldiers, escaped slaves, hired muscle, and desperate criminals. Some formed around neighborhoods. Others worked for wealthy political figures who secretly used violence to intimidate rivals. Power in Rome was not always won inside the Senate. Sometimes it was won with fists and knives in the streets. For ordinary citizens, this created a dangerous world where the law existed, but wasn't always present when it was needed. Imagine opening your small bakery before sunrise. You've spent the entire night preparing bread. The smell drifts into the street, attracting the first customers. Business begins well. Then 3 men arrive. They don't ask for bread. They don't smile. One quietly places his hand on your wooden counter. Another glances around the street. The third simply says, "Nice shop." It's not a compliment. It's a warning. Everyone understands what comes next. If you want your business to stay safe, you'll help us. No official tax collector stands beside them. No legal document is presented. Yet refusing isn't really an option. Because tomorrow your windows might be smashed, your supplies could disappear overnight, or you might be attacked while walking home after sunset. Many shopkeepers paid, not because they wanted to, because they wanted to survive. Violence wasn't always necessary. The threat alone was enough. These gangs also controlled information. News traveled quickly through Rome, but so did rumors. If someone cheated the wrong people, everyone knew by the following morning. If a merchant cooperated with authorities, whispers spread through the neighborhood before sunset. Trust became extremely valuable. So did silence. Parents warned their children from an early age. Don't repeat everything you hear. Don't point at strangers. And never tell outsiders what happens on this street. These weren't simply lessons in good manners. They were survival skills. Political elections made the situation even worse. Rome liked to think of itself as a republic governed by law and public debate. The reality could be surprisingly violent. Ambitious politicians sometimes hired groups of supporters to intimidate opponents. Crowds gathered. Arguments erupted. Stones flew through the air. Soon fists replaced speeches. Ancient historians describe elections where violence became so common that many citizens stayed away entirely, fearing they might be caught in the chaos. the gangs discovered something important. Fear could be more profitable than robbery. A frightened merchant paid regularly. A frightened witness stayed quiet. A frightened neighborhood remained under control. Some gangs even settled disputes. If two families argued over property or money, they might seek help, not from a magistrate, but from the local strongmen. Justice depended less on fairness and more on influence. Not every gang member was born a criminal. Many had once been ordinary workers. Some were unemployed laborers unable to find steady income. Others were former soldiers who returned from distant wars with few opportunities waiting for them. Rome rewarded military victories, but it didn't always reward the men who fought them. For some veterans, joining violent groups offered food, protection, and purpose. It wasn't honorable, but it was practical. Life in the poorest districts often forced impossible choices. A young man growing up in these streets watched wealthy Romans ride through the city carried by servants. He watched senators wearing expensive robes. He watched merchants counting fortunes larger than his family could imagine. Meanwhile, his own parents struggled to afford bread. Crime didn't excuse itself, but poverty made temptation much stronger. Not everyone resisted it. Despite their reputation, even gangs followed certain unwritten rules. Attacking someone from their own neighborhood could create dangerous enemies. Stealing from local families often damaged support. Outsiders, they were easier targets. Travelers unfamiliar with the streets, merchants arriving from distant provinces, foreign visitors who carried money and had nowhere to seek help. These became preferred victims. The narrow alleys worked perfectly for ambushes. One man blocked the front. Another appeared behind. The victim had nowhere to run. Most surrendered their money without a fight. Property could be replaced. Life could not. Yet despite everything, courage still existed. Many ordinary Romans refused to surrender their dignity. Neighbors looked after one another. If an elderly widow lived alone, nearby families sometimes checked on her. When a fire destroyed an apartment, those with little still shared what they could. Bread, blankets, a place to sleep. The poorest people often understood generosity better than the wealthy, because they knew how quickly fortune could change. Today's helper might become tomorrow's victim. Community became a form of protection that gangs could never fully destroy. Even criminals understood one simple truth. A united neighborhood was much harder to intimidate. Still, every evening as the shadows lengthened and shopkeepers closed their doors, the same uneasy feeling returned. Would tonight remain peaceful? Or would another fight erupt before dawn? No one knew. Because in ancient Rome's most feared district, uncertainty itself had become part of everyday life. And while violence frightened people, there was something else that terrified them even more. A disaster that could erase an entire neighborhood in a single night. Fire. The greatest nightmare of ancient Rome was about to begin. The night Rome burned. For the people living in ancient Rome's poorest district, there was one sound more terrifying than the shout of a thief or the clash of a drunken fight. It was a single, desperate cry. Fire. The word could spread through an entire neighborhood in seconds. A woman leaning out of her window heard it first. She shouted to the family across the alley. They shouted to the next building. Within moments, Dozens of frightened voices echoed through the narrow streets. "Fire! Run! Get out!" Panic moved faster than the flames. Imagine waking in the middle of the night to the smell of smoke. At first you think someone nearby is cooking late. Then your eyes begin to sting. You hear hurried footsteps outside your door. Someone pounds on the wall, screaming for everyone to wake up. You open the door. Instead of darkness, the staircase is glowing orange. The fire has already reached the lower floors. There is no time to gather your belongings, no time to think, only time to run. In ancient Rome, this nightmare was frighteningly common. The city's poorest neighborhoods were built almost perfectly for disaster. The apartment buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, separated by little more than narrow alleyways. Many were made with wooden beams, timber floors, and wooden balconies that had dried under the hot Mediterranean sun for years. Once one building caught fire. The next was only a few feet away. A strong evening wind could carry burning embers across the street. Within minutes, several buildings might be burning at once. The people trapped inside faced impossible choices. Some rushed toward the staircases. Others climbed onto rooftops, hoping to escape across neighboring buildings. Parents carried sleeping children through clouds of smoke. Elderly residents struggled to breathe as they searched desperately for the nearest exit. Not everyone made it. The upper floors were the most dangerous. Families living there had the cheapest apartments. Unfortunately, they also had the longest escape. A staircase filled with smoke quickly became deadly. Many people found themselves trapped above the flames. Some prayed, some cried for help. Others jumped. Even if they survived the fall, they often suffered terrible injuries. Down below, chaos consumed the streets. People formed desperate lines, passing buckets of water from hand to hand. Neighbors risked their own lives to rescue complete strangers. Mothers searched frantically for missing children. Fathers ran back into burning buildings, hoping to save elderly parents or treasured possessions. Most returned empty-handed. Some never returned at all. Rome eventually developed one of the ancient world's first organized firefighting forces, known as the Vigils. Created during the reign of Emperor Augustus, these men patrolled the city at night, watching for signs of fire and responding whenever disaster struck. They were more than firefighters. They also acted as night watchmen and helped maintain order after dark. But even the Vigils faced enormous challenges. Their equipment was simple: buckets, axes, hooks, blankets soaked in water. Sometimes they tore down nearby buildings to create gaps that prevented flames from spreading further. It was a desperate solution: destroy one home to save 20 others. Many families watched helplessly as firefighters demolished houses that had not yet caught fire. Painful as it was, they understood why. Without those sacrifices, entire districts might disappear. One of the most famous disasters in Roman history occurred in 64 AD during the reign of Emperor Nero. A massive fire swept through Rome, burning for days. Ancient historians describe flames racing through crowded neighborhoods, destroying homes, temples, shops, and public buildings. Exactly how the fire began remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Some blamed accident. Others accused Emperor Nero himself. Modern historians continue to debate the truth. What is certain is that the destruction was enormous. Thousands of people lost everything. Entire communities vanished beneath ash and rubble. Even after the flames died, suffering continued. Families wandered the streets, searching for missing relatives. People slept in open fields because their homes no longer existed. Food became scarce, prices rose, disease threatened those forced into temporary shelters. For the poor, rebuilding life was often harder than surviving the fire itself. Yet something remarkable always happened after these disasters. The next morning, or the next week, or the next month, Rome began rebuilding, stone by stone, wall by wall, street by street. The city refused to stay broken. Workers cleared away blackened timbers. Merchants reopened market stalls beneath temporary roofs. Children returned to playing among piles of rubble, treating yesterday's tragedy as today's playground. Life continued because it had to. Perhaps that is one of ancient Rome's greatest lessons. Its people lived with dangers that would terrify most of us today. Crime, disease, collapsing buildings, constant poverty, and fires capable of destroying entire neighborhoods overnight. Yet every morning they woke up and started again, not because they were fearless, but because survival left them no other choice. As the smoke finally drifted away from the ruined streets, another truth became impossible to ignore. For all its wealth, for all its military victories, for all its magnificent temples and palaces, Rome remained a city sharply divided, a place where the lives of the rich and the poor could be separated by only a few streets, yet feel like completely different worlds. And nowhere was that contrast more striking than inside the homes of Rome's wealthiest citizens. Two Romes living side by side. As the smoke cleared and the city slowly returned to its endless routine, one question remained. How could the greatest city in the ancient world contain so much suffering? The answer could be found by walking only a few streets away. Leave behind the overcrowded apartments, the noisy taverns, and the narrow alleys, and Rome began to transform before your eyes. The air felt cleaner, the streets became wider, the buildings stood farther apart, the constant shouting faded into quiet conversations. Instead of cracked walls and leaning apartment blocks, elegant villas appeared behind high stone walls. Marble columns supported shaded courtyards. Carefully tended gardens filled the air with the scent of roses, lavender, and fresh herbs. Small fountains trickled gently into polished pools, creating a peaceful sound almost impossible to imagine in the city's poorest district. This was the Rome most visitors dreamed about. The Rome of senators, generals, successful merchants, and noble families whose names had been respected for generations. Inside these homes, life followed a completely different rhythm. Servants rose before dawn to prepare breakfast. Fresh bread arrived still warm from the ovens. Fruit, cheese, honey, olives, and fine wine were served on beautifully crafted dishes. Children from wealthy families were educated by private tutors, learning literature, philosophy, mathematics, and public speaking. Their future seemed almost guaranteed. Across the city, children living in the poorest district were beginning their own day. Many had no formal education. Instead of studying philosophy, they learned how to carry heavy loads, sell goods in crowded markets, or help support their families before they were even old enough to understand the world around them. 2 children could be born on the same day, in the same city. Yet their lives would unfold in completely different ways. One might grow up debating politics in the Senate. The other might spend every day wondering where tomorrow's meal would come from. That was ancient Rome, a city united by its walls, but divided by wealth. The contrast extended far beyond food and education. When wealthy Romans became ill, experienced physicians visited their homes. When poor families became sick, they often relied on neighbors, herbal remedies, or simple hope. If a rich man's house needed repairs, skilled craftsmen arrived quickly. If an apartment in the poor district began collapsing, tenants often waited weeks or months for landlords to do anything at all. Sometimes nothing was ever repaired. Yet despite these differences, the two worlds depended upon one another. The wealthy relied on laborers to build homes, transport goods, prepare food, and clean the city. The poor relied on wealthy employers for work and wages. Neither side could truly exist without the other. Rome functioned because millions of ordinary people performed countless ordinary tasks every single day. The baker kneaded dough before sunrise. The porter hauled grain from the docks. The blacksmith forged tools and horseshoes. The laundress scrubbed clothes until her hands became rough and sore. The mason repaired damaged walls. The fisherman rose before dawn to cast his nets into the Tiber River. History rarely remembers their names, yet without them, Rome would have stopped. The city's greatest monuments were built by hands and history almost completely forgot. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, another difference became obvious. Entertainment. The wealthy could host extravagant banquets lasting deep into the night. Musicians performed. Poets recited new works. Guests discussed politics, while servants constantly refilled their wine cups. Meanwhile, entertainment in the poorer districts looked very different. Street performers gathered crowds with juggling, music, storytelling, and comic plays. Children laughed as trained animals performed simple tricks. Fortune tellers promised exciting futures for a few small coins. Even in difficult circumstances, people searched for moments of joy. Perhaps that is one of the most timeless qualities in human history. People celebrate whenever they can. Even during hardship, even when tomorrow is uncertain. But there was another place where rich and poor sometimes stood side by side. The public baths. For a few hours, social differences became less visible. Citizens came to wash away the dust of the streets, relax tired muscles, meet friends, discuss business, and exchange the latest news. Conversations echoed through warm rooms filled with steam. Politics mixed with gossip. Business deals began beside the pools. Stories from distant provinces spread from traveler to traveler. The baths reminded everyone that despite their differences, they all belonged to the same enormous empire. Still, when evening arrived, the illusion faded. The wealthy returned to comfortable homes protected by guards. The poor walked back toward crowded districts where danger waited patiently for darkness to fall once again. It was almost as if two different cities occupied the same map. One built from marble, the other built from survival, and although emperors proudly called Rome the capital of civilization, the truth hidden inside its worst district revealed something far more complicated. Because behind every glorious empire, there are always people whose struggles are forgotten, and their stories deserve to be remembered just as much as those of emperors and generals. But one question still remains. Why did so many people continue coming to Rome? Knowing exactly how dangerous life there could be? The answer lay in a single, powerful force that had shaped the city from the very beginning. Hope, the city that promised everything. If life in Rome's worst district was so dangerous, why did people continue coming? Why would anyone willingly leave a quiet village, a small farm, or a distant province to settle in a city filled with crime, disease, collapsing buildings, and constant uncertainty? The answer was surprisingly simple, because Rome represented possibility. To millions across the empire, Rome was more than just a city. It was a dream. From the misty forests of Britannia to the deserts of North Africa, from the mountains of Hispania to the bustling ports of Greece, stories about Rome traveled farther than Roman armies themselves. People heard about its towering temples, its magnificent forums, its endless markets, its wealth, its opportunities. If you worked hard enough, perhaps you could build a better life. Perhaps your children would have a brighter future. Perhaps fortune was waiting just beyond the next horizon. That hope drew people toward Rome every single day. Some arrived with wagons full of goods. Others carried nothing but the clothes they wore. Many had never seen a city so enormous. As they approached the great walls, they stared in amazement. The roads were crowded with merchants, leading mules loaded with grain and wine. Soldiers marched in disciplined formations. Officials hurried between government buildings. Foreign traders spoke languages that newcomers had never heard before. Rome felt like the center of the world. And in many ways, it truly was. But the city had no way of knowing who would succeed or who would fail. The lucky few found opportunity almost immediately. A skilled craftsman might secure work repairing public buildings. A talented merchant could open a successful shop. A soldier completing military service might receive land or a respectable position. Some immigrants eventually became wealthy enough to move into safer neighborhoods. Their stories inspired countless others. Unfortunately, those stories were the exception. Most newcomers discovered a far harsher reality. Finding work was difficult. Finding affordable housing was even harder. The cheapest apartments were almost always located in the poorest districts, the same neighborhoods everyone warned them about. At first, many believed the danger had been exaggerated. They told themselves they would only stay a few months, just long enough to earn some money, just long enough to get established. Then they would move somewhere better. Months became years. Years became decades. For countless families, that temporary apartment became home. The streets they once feared became familiar. The neighbors became friends. The dangers became ordinary. Children were born. Families grew. Entire generations spent their lives inside neighborhoods that outsiders viewed with horror. Life adapted, as it always does. Rome itself never stopped expanding. Every sunrise brought more wagons through the city gates, more merchants, more laborers, more travelers chasing the same dream. Some found success. Many simply survived. But survival itself required incredible determination. Picture a young man arriving from a small farming village. His hands are rough from years of working the land. He carries a small leather bag containing everything he owns. A few coins, a spare tunic, perhaps a letter of introduction from a distant relative already living in Rome. He steps into the city, believing his future is about to begin. By the end of his first week, his money is almost gone. Finding steady work proves harder than expected. Every morning, dozens of laborers gather in public squares, hoping someone will hire them. Some are chosen. Others wait all day. before returning home empty-handed. Tomorrow they try again. This uncertainty defines life for many ordinary Romans. No guaranteed income, no social safety net, no certainty that tomorrow will be better than today. Yet giving up rarely feels like an option. Returning home without success carries its own shame, so they remain, they adapt, they persevere. Women contribute just as much to this struggle. Many manage households under incredibly difficult conditions. They prepare meals from limited ingredients, care for children, wash clothing by hand, fetch water from public fountains. Some earn extra money by weaving, sewing, selling goods, or helping in family businesses. Their work is constant, often unnoticed, yet absolutely essential. Without them, families could not survive. Even children shoulder responsibilities far earlier than we would expect today. A young boy may help his father carry tools to a construction site. A girl might assist her mother in the marketplace. Play exists, but work usually comes first. Every member of the household contributes, because everyone understands the same truth. One bad week can change everything. A lost job, a serious illness, a building fire, a landlord demanding higher rent. Any one of these can push a struggling family into complete poverty. Still, people continue smiling, celebrating festivals, cheering chariot races, falling in love, getting married, raising children, dreaming about tomorrow. History often focuses on emperors, battles, and political conspiracies. Yet the true heart of Rome beats inside these ordinary moments. A father teaching his son a trade, a mother comforting her frightened daughter during a thunderstorm, neighbors sharing bread when another family has nothing left to eat, friends laughing together after a long day's work. These quiet acts of kindness rarely appear in ancient records, but they kept the city alive. Perhaps that is the greatest surprise hidden within Rome's worst district. It was not defined only by fear. It was also defined by resilience, by courage, by ordinary people refusing to surrender, even when life seemed determined to test them every single day. Yet despite all their strength, one event could still unite the entire neighborhood in fear. Not crime, not disease, not hunger, but the sudden arrival of the emperor's officials. Because when Rome's rulers came looking for someone, everyone paid attention. When the empire knocked on your door. In Rome's poorest district, people feared many things. They feared fires that could erase a lifetime of memories before sunrise. They feared disease that entered quietly and left empty beds behind. They feared thieves hiding in dark alleyways and buildings that groaned under their own weight. But there was another kind of fear, a quieter fear. One that arrived wearing official authority. It began with a knock on the door. Unlike criminals, government officials did not hide in the shadows. They walked openly through the streets, often accompanied by assistants, clerks, or guards. Their presence alone could change the atmosphere of an entire neighborhood. Conversations suddenly became quieter. Shopkeepers looked up from their work. Children stopped playing. People watched carefully without appearing to stare. No one wanted unnecessary attention, because when the empire came looking for someone, it was rarely for good news. Sometimes it was about unpaid taxes. Sometimes it involved legal disputes. Sometimes officials were searching for witnesses, fugitives, or escaped slaves, and occasionally they simply carried orders that ordinary citizens had no power to refuse. Rome was an enormous empire, stretching across 3 continents at its height. Governing such a vast territory required an equally vast bureaucracy. Clerks kept records. Collectors gathered taxes. Magistrates settled disputes. Messengers carried orders across cities and provinces. To the rulers of Rome, this system represented order. To many ordinary people, it represented uncertainty. Imagine working every day just to earn enough money for food and rent. Now imagine being told that part of those hard-earned coins must also go to the state. Most people understood why taxes existed. The roads they walked on, the aqueducts bringing fresh water, the soldiers protecting the empire. None of these were free, but understanding a tax did not make paying it any easier, especially during difficult years, a poor harvest, a sick family member, a workplace accident. Any of these could leave a household unable to meet its obligations. Debt became a constant shadow over many families. Moneylenders offered loans, sometimes with harsh terms. Missing payments could have serious consequences. Some people lost property, others lost their independence. The poorest often found themselves trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to escape. Not every official was cruel. Many simply performed their duties honestly. But power has always carried the risk of abuse. Corruption existed in ancient Rome, just as it has existed in many societies throughout history. A dishonest official could demand extra payments. A wealthy citizen might influence a legal decision. Someone with powerful connections often enjoyed advantages unavailable to ordinary people. The law promised justice. Reality could be far more complicated. Even so, Rome's legal system was remarkably advanced for its time. Courts handled disputes. Written laws established rules. Citizens possessed legal rights that were respected in many situations. Compared with much of the ancient world, Roman law represented a significant achievement. But those achievements did not erase inequality. A wealthy senator accused of wrongdoing rarely faced the same experience as a poor laborer. Status mattered. Reputation mattered. Connections mattered. The people living in the worst district understood this better than anyone. They learned to avoid unnecessary conflicts, to settle arguments quietly whenever possible, to remain invisible, because attracting official attention often brought more problems than solutions. Yet there were moments when the empire's presence inspired pride instead of fear. Public celebrations transformed the city. Victorious generals marched through Rome in magnificent triumphs. Captured treasures from distant lands filled the streets. Exotic animals amazed cheering crowds. Soldiers returned home wearing armor scarred by battles fought hundreds of miles away. For a little while, even the poorest neighborhoods shared in the excitement. Children climbed onto rooftops, hoping to glimpse the procession. Families crowded along the roads. People forgot their daily struggles as music echoed between the buildings. They remembered that they belonged to something extraordinary. The greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. It was a powerful contradiction. The same government that demanded taxes also built roads connecting continents. The same rulers who exercised immense authority also created monuments that still stand today. Rome inspired admiration and frustration in equal measure. Its citizens loved their city. They complained about it constantly. They dreamed of escaping it. Yet many could never imagine living anywhere else, because despite all its flaws, Rome offered something almost no other place could. Opportunity, excitement, a chance, however small, to change your destiny. And perhaps that explains why even the most feared district never became empty. People stayed. New families arrived, life continued. The streets remained crowded, the markets remained busy, the city never stopped breathing. But as the years passed, another question slowly emerged. Was the district truly the most dangerous place in Rome? Or had stories and rumors made it seem even more terrifying than it really was? Separating myth from reality is never easy. And that is where our journey through ancient Rome takes its most fascinating turn. The truth behind Rome's most feared district. By now you might be wondering something important. Was Rome's worst district truly as terrifying as people claimed? Or had centuries of stories exaggerated its reputation? The answer lies somewhere in between. Ancient Romans loved telling stories. Just as people today share dramatic headlines and unbelievable rumors, Romans passed tales from one person to another in crowded marketplaces, noisy taverns, and busy public baths. Every retelling added another detail. A thief who stole a purse became a ruthless gang leader. A small fire that destroyed one building became a blaze that consumed an entire neighborhood. A drunken argument turned into a deadly battle involving dozens of men. Fear has a remarkable way of growing with every conversation, but that doesn't mean the danger wasn't real. It absolutely was. Ancient writers like Juvenal and Martial described the hardships of living in Rome's crowded neighborhoods. They complained about collapsing buildings, sleepless nights, endless noise, and the constant fear of objects falling from apartment windows. Their writings weren't official reports. They were observations from people who actually experienced the city. Sometimes humorous, sometimes exaggerated, but always rooted in recognizable reality. The district's reputation didn't appear overnight. It developed over generations. Every robbery, every fire, every building collapse, every unexplained disappearance added another layer to its legend. Soon, the neighborhood became famous across Rome. Visitors avoided it whenever possible. Parents used it to frighten disobedient children. Travelers asked local guides which streets they should never enter after sunset. Its name alone inspired caution. Yet, if you had walked through those same streets during the middle of a sunny afternoon, you might have been surprised. You would have seen children laughing as they chased wooden hoops along the pavement, women chatting while buying vegetables, bakers pulling fresh loaves from hot ovens, tailors repairing worn clothing, blacksmiths hammering glowing iron, ordinary people living ordinary lives. The terrifying district was also a neighborhood. People celebrated birthdays there. Families gathered for meals. Neighbors borrowed tools from one another. Young couples dreamed about marriage. Old friends shared stories from decades past. Life continued much as it did anywhere else. This is one of history's most important lessons. Places remembered for violence are rarely violent every single moment. Most of the time, people are simply living, working, laughing, trying to survive. The dangerous moments become famous because they are unusual, but daily life is built from countless ordinary moments that history rarely records. Archaeology has helped us understand this hidden side of ancient Rome, Excavations have uncovered apartment buildings, workshops, bakeries, taverns, and household objects that reveal how ordinary citizens actually lived. Broken pottery, cooking utensils, children's toys, coins dropped centuries ago, even graffiti scratched into walls. Together, these discoveries paint a picture far richer than legends alone. Some graffiti advertised gladiator games, some declared love for another person, others simply complained about everyday life. In many ways, the voices of ordinary Romans don't sound so different from our own. They worried about money, they argued with neighbors, they joked with friends, they hoped tomorrow would be better than today. The more historians learn about ancient Rome, the clearer one truth becomes. The city wasn't divided into heroes and villains. It was filled with human beings, some generous, some dishonest, some courageous, some selfish, most somewhere in between. The same district that frightened wealthy senators also produced skilled craftsmen whose work helped build the empire. The same streets known for crime raised children who later became soldiers, merchants, teachers, and respected citizens. Life was never as simple as the rumors suggested. Still, there was one thing almost everyone agreed upon. After sunset, you stayed alert. Because even if the stories had grown larger over time, the darkness still belonged to uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous enough. As our journey through Rome's most feared district nears its end, one final question remains. What happened to this neighborhood? Did it disappear forever? Or can traces of it still be found beneath the streets of modern Rome? The answer connects the ancient world to our own in a way few people expect, walking through the shadows of the past. More than 2,000 years have passed since the streets of ancient Rome echoed with the sound of wooden carts, shouting merchants, and hurried footsteps, disappearing into the darkness. The empire that once ruled much of the known world is gone. Its emperors are long dead. Its soldiers no longer march beneath the banners of Rome, and yet the city never truly disappeared. If you walk through modern Rome today, you are not simply walking across a modern capital. You are walking on top of history itself. Beneath busy streets, apartment buildings, cafes, and bustling intersections lie the remains of the ancient city. Layer upon layer of forgotten roads, collapsed houses, buried marketplaces, and abandoned workshops still rest beneath the feet of millions of people. In some places, archaeologists have uncovered entire neighborhoods frozen in time. Stone streets still bear the deep grooves carved by wagon wheels. Public fountains still stand where thirsty Romans once filled their clay jars. Fragments of colorful mosaics remain where wealthy families entertained guests nearly 2,000 years ago. Even graffiti survives. Messages scratched into walls by ordinary people who never imagined anyone would read their words centuries later. Some are humorous, some are political, some simply declare love. Together, they remind us that history was lived by real people, not just emperors and generals. The district that was once feared has changed beyond recognition. The dangerous alleys are no longer ruled by gangs. The wooden apartment buildings have vanished. The smoke from thousands of cooking fires no longer darkens the sky. The cries of merchants have faded into silence. Yet the stories remain. Historians continue piecing together fragments of evidence, ancient writings, archaeological discoveries, broken pottery, coins, and the foundations of long-forgotten buildings, to understand what life was really like for the people who called these neighborhoods home. And what they have discovered is both surprising and deeply human. Yes, the district was dangerous. Crime was real. Fires were devastating. Buildings sometimes collapsed. Disease spread quickly through crowded streets. But that is only half of the story. The other half belongs to the ordinary men, women, and children who woke every morning determined to build a life despite those hardships. The baker who lit his oven before dawn. The mother carrying water up 6 flights of stairs. The blacksmith whose hammer echoed through the streets from sunrise until sunset. The child chasing friends through narrow alleys, laughing without knowing that future generations would remember the neighborhood only for its dangers. They were the true heart of Rome. History often celebrates victory. It remembers emperors. It records wars. But civilizations are not sustained by rulers alone. They are sustained by ordinary people doing extraordinary things every single day without expecting recognition. Perhaps that is why ancient Rome continues to fascinate us. It feels familiar. Its people worried about rising prices. They struggled to pay rent. They searched for stable work. They feared crime. They complained about noisy neighbors. They hoped their children would enjoy a better future than they had. Despite the centuries separating us, many of their hopes and fears remain our own. The city's worst district was feared because it exposed a truth that every great civilization eventually confronts. Magnificent monuments can inspire the world. Military victories can expand an empire. Immense wealth can build breathtaking architecture. But if ordinary people are forced to struggle every day simply to survive, the greatness of a civilization is never as complete as it appears. Ancient Rome understood power better than almost any society in history. Yet even Rome could not eliminate poverty. It could not completely stop corruption. It could not prevent disasters, and it could not erase the daily hardships faced by countless citizens living in its shadow. That is why this district matters. Not because it was the most violent, not because it was the poorest, but because it reminds us that history is never only about glory. It is also about resilience, about survival, about people who kept moving forward even when life offered them every reason to give up. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of Rome's most feared district. It was never just a place of danger. It was a place where courage quietly lived every single day. Long after the empire disappeared, long after the buildings crumbled into dust, the stories of those ordinary Romans continue to endure. And as long as we continue telling them, their footsteps will never truly fade from the streets of history, the district that never truly disappeared. If you could stand on a rooftop overlooking ancient Rome just before sunset, you would notice something remarkable. The city seemed endless. Smoke curled upward from thousands of chimneys. The sound of hammers echoed from distant workshops. The smell of bread drifted through the evening air. Merchants hurried to finish their final sales before darkness arrived. From that height, every street looked like part of a single magnificent city. But down below, life was completely different. A wealthy senator returning home would pass marble temples, triumphal arches, and elegant villas before reaching his residence. Only a few streets away, another Roman would spend the evening wondering whether tomorrow's wages would be enough to buy bread. The distance between wealth and poverty was measured not in miles, but in minutes. That contrast became one of Rome's defining characteristics. It was a city where incredible luxury and desperate hardship existed side by side, often separated by nothing more than a single intersection. For generations, the poorest districts carried a reputation that frightened outsiders. Travelers repeated the stories wherever they went. Merchants warned one another. Parents frightened children with tales of dangerous alleys. Over time, those neighborhoods became symbols of everything people feared about city life. Yet symbols often hide the truth, because behind every frightening story lived ordinary people. The widow who opened her tiny food stall before sunrise. The young apprentice carefully learning his master's trade. The elderly couple sitting outside their apartment, watching children play in the street. The father returning home exhausted after carrying heavy cargo across the city all day. These people rarely appeared in official records. No statues were built in their honor. No triumphs celebrated their achievements. But without them, Rome would never have functioned. Every loaf of bread baked, every cart repaired, every roof rebuilt after a fire, every shipment unloaded from the river. These quiet acts kept the greatest empire in the ancient world alive. That is why historians today pay increasing attention to ordinary lives rather than only extraordinary events. Because an empire is not truly understood by studying emperors alone, it is understood by listening to the voices history almost forgot. Archaeologists have uncovered worn sandals left behind by workers, simple clay lamps once used to light tiny apartments, children's toys carved from wood or bone, needles used by tailors, cooking pots blackened by years of use. These are humble discoveries, yet together they tell an extraordinary story. They remind us that history is not merely a collection of dates and battles. It is the memory of millions of individual lives. Each one mattered. Each one contributed something, even those who never imagined anyone would remember them. The worst district of ancient Rome eventually changed. Buildings collapsed and were rebuilt. Roads were repaired. New emperors introduced reforms. Neighborhoods expanded. Others disappeared beneath newer construction. Century after century, the city continued evolving. Yet one thing remained remarkably constant. People. They continued arriving with hope. They continued struggling. They continued adapting. And they continued believing tomorrow might be better than today. That belief is perhaps the most powerful force in human history. Empires rise, empires fall, cities burn, cities are rebuilt. Generations come and go. Hope remains. It is the reason families rebuilt homes after devastating fires. It is the reason merchants reopened shops after losing everything. It is the reason parents continued raising children in neighborhoods others feared. Oh, hope convinced them that life was still worth living. As historians, archaeologists, and curious travelers continue uncovering the hidden layers of ancient Rome, they are discovering that the city's darkest places also contained remarkable resilience. The district was feared. There is no doubt about that. But fear was never its only story. It was also a place of determination, of friendship, of sacrifice, of ordinary courage, repeated thousands of times every single day. Perhaps that is why these forgotten streets continue capturing our imagination more than 2,000 years later, because beneath the ruins of Rome
We do not simply find broken stone, we find ourselves. The same fears, the same dreams, the same determination to survive, the same hope that tomorrow will bring something better than today. And in that way, the people of Rome's most feared district were never so different from us after all. The lesson hidden beneath Rome's greatest empire. For centuries, people looked at ancient Rome and saw only greatness. They saw conquering armies marching across continents. They saw magnificent temples rising toward the sky. They saw engineers building roads, bridges, and aqueducts that amazed the ancient world. They saw emperors dressed in purple robes, surrounded by wealth and power, beyond imagination. And they believed they had seen the whole story. But history is rarely that simple. The true measure of a civilization is not found only in its grandest monuments. It is also found in the lives of the people who walked beneath them every single day. The baker who rose long before sunrise. The mother who carried water up endless flights of stairs. The child who learned to survive in crowded streets before learning to read. The laborer whose hands built Rome's greatest buildings, yet who could never afford to live near them. These people never expected history to remember their names, yet without them, there would have been no Rome. When we hear the words, Rome's worst district, it is easy to imagine nothing but crime, violence, and misery. Those things certainly existed, but they never told the whole story. Because every morning, despite all the dangers, the streets filled with life once again. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air. Market stalls reopened. Blacksmiths lit their furnaces. Children laughed while chasing one another through narrow alleys. Neighbors greeted familiar faces. Life refused to surrender. That quiet determination may have been the greatest strength of all. Historians sometimes focus on dramatic moments, great battles, political conspiracies, assassinations, triumphal marches. Those events shaped history, but they did not sustain civilization. Civilization survives because ordinary people continue doing ordinary work. Someone must bake the bread. Someone must repair the roads. Someone must unload the grain ships arriving from Egypt. Someone must care for children, heal the sick, sew clothing, build homes, and keep markets alive. Ancient Rome was no different. Every emperor depended on countless citizens whose names have been lost forever. And perhaps that is why the city's poorest districts deserve just as much attention as its palaces. They reveal something monuments cannot. They reveal resilience. Walk through those ancient streets one final time in your imagination. The sun is setting. Merchants are packing away their goods. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires. Some families are sharing a simple evening meal. Others worry whether there will be enough food tomorrow. A child laughs somewhere in the distance. An old man sits outside his doorway, watching the neighborhood slowly disappear into twilight. The streets are familiar. The dangers are familiar too. Yet no one is leaving. Because this place, despite everything, is still home. That is what outsiders rarely understood. They saw only fear. The people who lived there also saw friendship, community, shared struggles, shared victories. When a fire destroyed a building, neighbors often helped rebuild it. When illness struck one family, others shared what little food they had. When someone lost everything, it was often ordinary people, not powerful officials, who offered the first helping hand. These acts were never recorded in grand history books, yet they happened every day, and they mattered.
perhaps more than anything else. As the centuries passed, Rome changed. New rulers came. Old buildings disappeared. Churches rose where temples once stood. Ancient streets were buried beneath newer ones. Eventually, the feared district itself faded into history. But its story never truly ended. Because every great city throughout history has had places like it. Neighborhoods misunderstood by outsiders. Communities remembered only for their hardships. Places where ordinary people quietly built extraordinary lives despite impossible circumstances. Rome simply reminds us that these stories deserve to be told. Not because they are comfortable, but because they are true. And sometimes, the truest stories are found far away from palaces and kings. They are found in crowded streets where ordinary people fought the hardest battles of all. The battle to survive. The battle to protect their families. The battle to keep hope alive when everything around them suggested they should give up. That battle has no monuments, no triumphal arches, no statues, yet it remains one of humanity's greatest achievements. And with that understanding, only one final chapter remains. Not about fear, not about crime, not even about Rome itself, but about why, after more than 2,000 years, we are still fascinated by the forgotten streets of the ancient world, the forgotten people who built an empire. As our journey through ancient Rome draws closer to its end, it is worth asking one final question. When people think about Rome, whose faces come to mind? Most imagine Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. They picture Augustus becoming the first emperor. They think of gladiators fighting before roaring crowds in the Colosseum. They remember victorious generals returning from distant wars, their triumphal processions filling the streets with music and celebration. These are the images that have survived for centuries, but they're only a small part of Rome's story. The real Rome, the city that woke before dawn and refused to sleep until long after sunset, belonged to millions of ordinary people whose names have been lost forever. They were the invisible foundation of the empire. Every loaf of bread sold in the marketplace had been mixed, kneaded, and baked by someone's hands. Every marble temple that impressed visiting ambassadors had first been carved by stonemasons covered in dust. Every ship arriving from Egypt with grain had been unloaded by exhausted dock workers standing beneath the scorching Mediterranean sun. Every road leading to Rome had been laid stone by laborers whose stories history never recorded. Without these people, Rome's greatness would have existed only in dreams. The empire was not built by emperors alone. It was built by ordinary lives repeated millions of times. In the city's most feared district, those ordinary lives were especially difficult. Each day began with uncertainty. Would there be enough work? Would the landlord raise the rent again? Would sickness enter the household? Would the building survive another winter? Would everyone return home safely after sunset? These were not extraordinary fears. They were part of everyday life. And yet, despite everything, people continued planning for the future. Young couples married. Children were born. Parents celebrated small victories, a successful day's work, a healthy newborn, a repaired roof, a neighbor recovering from illness. In neighborhoods where survival was never guaranteed, even the smallest moments of happiness became precious. This is something ancient history often struggles to capture. Stone ruins can tell us where people lived. Ancient texts can describe laws, wars, and politics. Coins can reveal the faces of emperors. But none of these can fully capture what it felt like to sit around a small evening meal with your family after surviving another difficult day. They cannot describe the relief of hearing your child laugh after recovering from a dangerous fever, or the comfort of knowing that your neighbors would come running if your home caught fire in the middle of the night. Those moments disappear with time, unless we imagine them. That is why history is more than memorizing dates. It is an attempt to understand people, to understand their hopes, their fears, their mistakes, their courage. The people living in Rome's worst district were not simply victims of poverty, nor were they merely characters in frightening stories. They were craftsmen, parents, dreamers, immigrants, workers, friends. They argued, they celebrated, they mourned, they loved. In other words, they lived. And perhaps that is the greatest surprise hidden within ancient Rome. The city, often remembered for power, was held together by compassion. The empire, famous for conquest, survived because ordinary citizens continued supporting one another through life's daily struggles. Long after emperors disappeared from history, long after palaces crumbled into ruins, the quiet strength of those forgotten people remained woven into the story of Rome itself. Today, millions of visitors walk through the Roman Forum, the Colosseum, and the ancient streets, marveling at what still stands. Few realize that beneath every monument lies another story. The story of the countless ordinary Romans who built, cleaned, repaired, protected, supplied, and sustained the greatest city of the ancient world. They never expected recognition, yet they deserve remembrance, because history is not only the story of the powerful, it is also the story of everyone else. And in the end, that may be the most important lesson Rome has left behind. The last walk through Rome's darkest streets. The sun is setting one last time over ancient Rome. Its golden light touches the marble temples, the triumphal arches, and the rooftops that stretch toward the horizon. For a brief moment, the entire city glows as if it has forgotten every hardship it has ever known. From a distance, Rome still looks invincible, the greatest empire on earth, a city of unmatched power, wealth, and ambition. But now, after walking through its most feared district, you know another side of the story. You know what existed beyond the monuments. You have walked through streets where apartment buildings leaned dangerously over narrow alleys. You have stood in marketplaces filled with the sounds of merchants struggling to earn enough for another day. You have watched families carry water up endless flights of stairs because running water never reached their homes. You have seen children grow up surrounded by danger, yet somehow still finding reasons to laugh. You have witnessed neighbors risking their own lives to pull strangers from burning buildings. You have listened to the whispers of people who hurried home before darkness because the night belonged to uncertainty. And perhaps you have realized something unexpected. Rome's worst district was never feared simply because it was dangerous. It was feared because it revealed a truth that every great civilization tries to hide. No empire is perfect. Behind every magnificent monument stands a worker whose name has been forgotten. Behind every military victory is a family waiting for someone to come home. Behind every palace is a neighborhood where ordinary people struggle to survive.
History often remembers the triumphs. It quietly forgets the sacrifices. Yet those sacrifices built the world. As darkness slowly settles across the city, oil lamps begin flickering behind small windows. A baker prepares tomorrow's dough before going to sleep. A mother gently covers her children with worn blankets. An old craftsman carefully places his tools beside the door, hoping there will still be work when morning comes. Somewhere a young boy looks toward the distant hills beyond Rome's walls and wonders what the future might hold. He does not know that historians will one day study the city where he lives. He does not know that people thousands of years in the future will try to imagine his life. To him, tomorrow is all that matters. And perhaps that is what connects us most deeply to ancient Rome. Not the emperors, not the battles, not even the magnificent ruins. It is the ordinary people. The people who worried about paying rent. The parents hoping their children would live better lives. The workers who came home exhausted after long days. The neighbors who shared what little they had during difficult times. Those people are timeless. Their world was different. Their hopes were not. Even today, cities around the world contain neighborhoods that outsiders misunderstand. Places remembered only for crime or poverty. Yet behind every door live families with dreams, friendships, traditions, and remarkable resilience. Ancient Rome reminds us to look beyond reputation, because every neighborhood has more than one story. Every city has hidden lives. Every civilization has voices, history almost forgotten. And sometimes, those forgotten voices teach us more than kings ever could. So the next time you see the towering ruins of Rome in a photograph or documentary, remember that beneath those stones lived millions of ordinary men and women whose names will never appear in history books. They were the bakers who fed the city, the builders who raised its walls, the mothers who held families together, the children who carried hope into the next generation. They did not command armies. They did not wear crowns. They did not expect to be remembered. Yet without them, there would have been no Rome. Perhaps that is why the city's most feared district continues to fascinate us after more than 2,000 years. Not because it was the darkest place in the empire, but because it was the most human. Its streets were filled with fear. Its homes were filled with hope. And in the end, hope proved stronger. The empire eventually faded. The buildings crumbled. The rulers passed into history. But the courage of ordinary people never truly disappeared. It survives in every stone that still stands, in every story that is still told, and in every person who pauses to wonder what life was really like behind the glory of ancient Rome. The greatest lesson of Rome's worst district is not that fear once ruled its streets. It is that, despite every hardship, life continued. People loved, people laughed, people dreamed, and every sunrise gave them one more chance to begin again.